let's talk a little bit about Las Vegas. That's another market that folks think are going to be influenced by the sports betting change. Obviously, for the longest time, you could only gamble on sports in Las Vegas, by federal statute. Now, as it opens up more nationwide, we're thinking about, is less traffic going to move out to Vegas? Vegas had 38 million visitors last year. What are your kind of thoughts on kind of that trend and what's going on in Vegas generally?
I think Vegas has done much in the past decade or so to get ahead of a potential trend like this, although I'm not sure that 10 years ago this was on their radar screen. But as a destination, it's really changed the way it markets itself. It's gone after corporate business in a huge way. And also Las Vegas has presented itself as a family-oriented destination. So you don't necessarily have to treat Las Vegas as Sin City. You can go there just for a fun weekend. If you like to gamble, you can gamble. If you just like to stroll around some what I think of as outre architecture with a drink in your hand, you can do that. So it's a fun place. I've been once as well and enjoyed my time there. Gambled a little bit, was there for a conference. So I think that the flow of traffic into Las Vegas won't necessarily be impacted. And I think that it's a very adaptable city as well. So Nick, you tweeted out for questions on the show yesterday, I believe, and actually a friend of mine who's an avid listener, Brandon Stokes, who supplies me with millennial stock ideas. I've mentioned that before. He asked about esports in this whole equation of legalized sports betting. And he pointed out that MGM actually has an arena for esports betting, which I was able to just briefly look at before the show. But there you go. There's one way that the location of Las Vegas can compete with evolving trends in technology. So my thought is probably there's the potential for a little bit of dip in traffic near term, but that resolves over time as it plays to traditional strengths. It's not going to lose huge traffic anytime soon. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you, Osset. Vegas is one of the most popular convention destinations in the United States, and it continues to be so. It had a little bit of a weaker year this year, but it's expecting things to come on strong next year. About 1/6 of Vegas's annual visitors come via convention attendance. Another thing to think about too is there's new attractions coming there. So next year I believe the Raiders are coming to Vegas. That's going to increase some traffic. If you want to go to a road game for your favorite football team, I think Vegas is going to be one of the top destinations you'd like to go see your team play. You saw the same thing happen this past year with the Golden Knights, right? You have tons of folks come down to Vegas to see their team play. So that's going to be an attraction as well. One thing to call out, too, to mention, when we're talking about Vegas, who are we talking about? And really, the two main players there in Vegas is going to be MGM and Caesars. They own about half the Strip. There are some other smaller players there as well. So Las Vegas Sands, we mentioned earlier, they're predominantly located in Macau, but they do have a couple casinos in Vegas. Same thing with Wynn. And, as we're talking about Las Vegas Sands and Wynn, let's talk about Macau and what's going on there. So we mentioned Vegas is the biggest gambling market in the U.S. domestically, but Macau is the largest in the world. It is the only place in China where folks are allowed to gamble, and about 70% of their visitors came from China, at least according to the data back in October. There's 41 casinos there. The major, several different operators, several different Chinese operators. The major U.S. companies are Las Vegas Sands, as I mentioned, Wynn Resorts, and MGM Resorts. What are your thoughts about what's going on there in Macau and just that market in general? It's the largest market in the world. It's most certainly the largest market in Asia. It's really been a place where folks have flocked in just because there's not a lot of other alternatives.
Yeah, so an example of a great long-term market, it's ideally situated. Here you go again. Regulation has ensured that Macau has its own built-in cash cow because there's so few places to gamble in Asia. And looking at some stats, 70%, you mentioned the Chinese market, 70% of Macau visitors came from China in October. Visitors grew 15.3% year over year. I find it fascinating that even though we've got more international players now, it's still dominated by SJM, the Chinese company, which has 20 casinos. And as this trade discussion has really turned hot over the last 6 months and turned really from a trade discussion into a full-blown trade war, you have to really factor that in when you look at the Macau market going forward. So we see that we have several casinos with concessions expirations coming up in 2020. SJM Holdings is up for renewal. MGM China is up for renewal. And in 2022, we've got Galaxy Entertainment, Wynn Macau, Melco Resorts, and Sands China. So we talked a little bit about this before the show in our back and forth, our notes. Nick, you had mentioned that a very well-known short seller is short on the American players in Macau, and this has something to do with the regulation, Jim Chanos. So can you just give us a brief overview of his opinion of Las Vegas Sands and Wynn and betting on them in China?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I'll give you his thesis, and then I'll maybe add a little editorial of my own. So Chanos' opinion here is that over the long term, we've seen the U.S. operators in China, U.S. casino operators, trade at a premium to their Chinese counterparts. But his position is that with the kind of trade tensions we've had between the U.S. and China, that there really shouldn't be, at least there should not, those companies should at least not be trading at a premium to those Chinese operators. And the risk to them is that if China were to decide to pull their concessions at any time, their business falls apart. If you can't offer your key service to that market, which is gambling, then you don't really have a business. And so the companies that he is short are Wynn and Las Vegas Sands. And so when you talk about politically, it might make sense for them to retaliate against U.S. operators if trade tensions were to continue. As I mentioned earlier, Sheldon Adelson is the top dog at Las Vegas Sands Corporation. He's a heavy donor to the Trump administration and to Republican politicians in general. So you layer on top of there's trade tensions in the U.S. and China, and that the head of one of these companies that is very heavily involved in Macau and that has concessions coming up is also heavily connected to the administration, which China would be retaliating against. It doesn't shock me that those sort of things would come to pass. What do you think, Asit?
I think that there's a reason that these companies actually trade at a premium to their Chinese counterparts, and that's because if you're centered in Macau, that's your only real operation. You have a concentrated market. So if primarily the Chinese economy, but other South Asian economies, if they start to decelerate, let's say in a global recession, if you're only based in Macau, then you're going to get hit proportionately harder. So some of these other international companies, U.S. companies in particular, are a little bit more diversified. So there are some underlying reasons why historically the U.S. companies have traded at a discount. I think, personal opinion, that at the end of the day, the trade disputes will have to resolve because China and the U.S. are just too important to each other not to resolve them. And I think in Macau, my expectation is that Las Vegas Sands and Wynn are going to have their licenses renewed. So I wouldn't be short these two companies just for this reason, for their operations in Macau. But I think it is an interesting thesis. It's certainly a risk, and who knows, Jim Chanos may be right and make a pool of money off it. One last thing I'll say about Macau is just the outlook for 2019. Because of all this uncertainty, JP Morgan analysts predict that gross gaming revenue is going to increase by only single digits this year. And Macau is sort of, if you look around the world, it's the go-go place for gambling. It's got high revenue increases almost every year. They're in the double digits. So we're going to have what's a relatively slower year in 2019, but the same analysts, among others, expect that after we get past this period of renewals, and even sooner, the growth is going to pick up again.
Yeah, Asit, I wanted to follow up on what you're saying about Jim Chanos. It's always dangerous when your investment thesis hinges upon government action of any kind, whether you have to have a law passed or some policy change. So I think building a thesis around that sort of thing is a very high level type of bet to make, that there's just a lot of various outcomes. So I wouldn't recommend anybody take a position in any company or any market that is dependent solely upon a government intervention to make that thesis come true. We'll see how it plays out for Mr. Chanos. He's a very sophisticated investor. But just for our listeners, that's typically, at least for me, is a no-go type of thesis on a business. One last thing before we start talking about these major U.S. casino operators on the back side of the show. We mentioned how Macau has been for the longest time just the center of the Asian gaming market. And there are some signs that we might have some new markets opening up over in that region. So in 2019, Japan is expected to approve 3 new casino licenses. And so we've seen several operators kind of circling around them, trying to go after those licenses. Among them, I believe you see Las Vegas Sands, and you're also seeing Caesars kind of circle for that. Caesars doesn't have any presence in Macau, so there is a little bit of a want for them to get some exposure over there. And then as well, we're starting to see some pushes for casinos in Vietnam, and Las Vegas Sands has some interest over there. What are your thoughts on those markets as opportunities for casino operators, as well as any kind of second order effects they might have when it comes to Macau?
Primarily, Japan is the market to look at. The population there is extremely hardworking, as everyone knows, and the Japanese love their diversions, whether it's in the youth dressing up in crazy ways or playing pachinko, which you pointed out to me. 5 million Japanese people are addicted to pachinko, this pinball-like game. I've had the opportunity to go to Japan, and I've seen these pachinko parlors. They're sort of incredible, very noisy, frenetic, but you can see how that's maybe a relaxing enterprise after you spent like a 12 or 15-hour workday. So I think that there's a huge potential there, both because Japan is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, has a very dense population. As I've said, that population is always looking for an outlet. It's an extremely attractive market for any of the major players and the ones, as you mentioned, like Caesars, who aren't in Macau. So I think that's the one to look at. Vietnam, I'm also very interested in. As for the effects for Macau, I think that as time goes on, as we've seen with the greater Chinese economy, there will be some loss of revenue as other players come in, other countries come in, and their regulations change and they allow more gambling. But to do that, you do need to have a relatively wealthy investment base, and you need capital to make it happen. So it won't be overnight. Macau, long term, like Las Vegas, will have staying power, and it has a first mover advantage in that region. But I'm keeping my eye on Japan. I just think that's a fascinating market. It's going to be highly regulated, so these changes won't happen overnight. The Japanese will be very careful in how their population responds to gambling, and also how they regulate the foreign countries coming in. Any thoughts from you on how Japan or Vietnam might affect Macau?
Sure. I think obviously when you have different alternatives, it's going to reduce the amount of need for someone to go out of their way to travel to Macau. So particularly among the Japanese market, I don't have any data on what segment of the market in Macau comes from Japan, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a meaningful amount. Just to kind of give a little bit extra color on what you're talking about from Japan from an opportunity perspective, some estimates have the Japan casino market at being $15.8 billion a year. Compare that to Nevada, it's $11.1 billion, so that's a significant market. You also mentioned efforts to kind of keep under wraps, how I guess big casinos can get and the kind of societal problems that can come along. So there have been talks on putting caps on how many visits a Japanese citizen can give to a casino in a month. Limiting the size of the casino to only 3% of the total area of the resort. So really confining how much, gaming space you can have. And then, putting a 30% tax on gaming. So, it's a huge opportunity that all these casino operators, want to get a bite out of, but it's still to be determined, how big that opportunity is going to be. And again, as we mentioned for sports betting, that all is going to come down to what the exact regulations look like and how these operators can navigate them.